everyone, today I'll be talking about empathy in video games and how the types of games we play can actually shape our behavior. While video games often get criticized for promoting violence, research shows that there's another side to the story, one where games can encourage helping, cooperation, and understanding. So let's take a closer look at what the research says and why it matters. A lot of modern research on video games' effects on behavior focuses on how playing violent games lowers prosocial behaviors, and this bias has left a stain on the public's opinion of video games in general. Some studies have come out in defense of video games and their beneficial effects, such as how action games can improve visual attention skills. From this, we know that video games aren't simply good or bad, but in fact there's a lot of nuance to be found. The general learning model is a learning theory that states that any stimulus should have short-term and long-term effects through various learning mechanisms. It states that any learning encounter can have affective, arousal, and/or cognitive effects. Over time, these effects could result in changes to perceptions, attitudes, stereotypes, and emotional response in the short and long term. Games can prime scripts and provide opportunities for operant reinforcement or punishment. Changes can also mutually reinforce classical and operant mechanisms in a feedback cycle. Some changes will result from repeated exposure, some from selective reinforcement, and others from playing multiple games with similar content. Prosocial behaviors are defined in the Gentile article as those intended to help others. So because this article was kind of the main focus of this week, I'm just going to give you a quick little summary, just a little refresher, even though I'm sure you guys all have read it. So basically this article kind of goes over all the research, a bunch of different studies that were conducted. The research shows that playing prosocial video games, which are games that involve helping others or working cooperatively, can lead to more empathetic, helpful, and cooperative behavior. Studies conducted in Singapore, Japan, and the United States have found that these positive effects can happen both in short term and over time. Interestingly, it's not the amount of time spent playing that makes the biggest difference, but the content of the game itself. In other words, what players do in the game matters more than how long that they play. So now I'm just going to go a little bit more in depth into each study, and then at the end we'll do a discussion of all of the results from each study. So the first study was a cross-sectional correlation study about video game habits and prosocial behaviors in Singaporean secondary school children. The participants consisted of 727 Singaporean secondary school children with a mean age of 13. The sample is 73% male and contains a spread of ethnicities representative of Singapore. Participants were questioned on their 3 favorite games, estimated number of hours per week spent playing each game, then they rated how often players hurt or kill others in the game versus helping others. To ensure self-report validity, the researchers compared the average violence rating provided by the students with expert ratings and found a large correlation. The study measured prosocial behavior with a few different subscales, 2 from Prosocial Orientation Questionnaire and 1 from Personal Strengths Inventory. Aggression was measured with the normative beliefs about aggression scale and an explanation exercise. Results showed a positive correlation between prosocial game exposure and prosocial behavior, even after controlling for the total amount of gaming, violent game exposure, sex, and age. They also showed that violent gameplay was negatively related to prosocial behavior. Okay, now moving on to study 2. This was the second study. It was a longitudinal study conducted in Japan, and it examined how prosocial video gameplay influenced later prosocial behavior in children and adolescents. Researchers collected data from 2 samples, one consisting of 780 fifth grade students and another of 1,050 students from 8th and 11th grades. Participants were surveyed twice over a period of 3 to 4 months. At both time points, students reported how frequently they played video games with prosocial content, such as scenes where characters helped others or expressed affection within families. They also rated how often they themselves had engaged in helpful behaviors, like assisting someone in need. This allowed the researchers to observe how changes in gameplay related to changes in real-world behavior. Using structural equation modeling, the study found that students who played more prosocial video games at first time point were more likely to report increased prosocial behavior at the second time point. The reverse was also true. Those who already showed higher levels of prosocial behavior were more likely to play prosocial games later. These findings indicate a bidirectional relationship, suggesting that prosocial behavior and prosocial gameplay can reinforce each other over time. This pattern supports the idea that positive gaming experiences may contribute to a cycle of continued helpfulness and empathy in everyday life. For the third and final study, it used a randomized controlled experimental design to establish causal relationships between video game content and subsequent prosocial behavior. This is crucial because it's the missing link in determining whether or not video games actually cause changes in behavior. The researchers recruited 161 undergraduate participants and randomly assigned them to one of three game categories: prosocial games such as Super Mario Sunshine and Chibi Robo, violent games including TY2 and Crash Twinsanity, or neutral control games like pinball, which have no social elements. Following 20 minutes of gameplay, participants completed a behavioral measure designed to assess prosocial and antisocial tendencies through the tangram puzzle task. The tangram task was used to study the immediate after effect of playing these games. It represents an innovative behavioral measure that captures actual helping and hurting behaviors rather than self-reported attitudes. Participants were informed they were selecting puzzles for another participant to complete, with successful completion of 10 out of 11 puzzles, resulting in a $10 reward for their partner. The task design required participants to choose from 30 available puzzles across 3 difficulty levels. Critically, this paradigm allowed researchers to operationalize prosocial behavior through easy puzzle selection and antisocial behavior through difficult puzzle selection, providing an objective to measure post-gameplay behavior. This experiment yielded striking results that demonstrate significant behavioral differences across game conditions. Participants exposed to prosocial game content exhibited significantly increased helping behavior, selecting more easy puzzles for their partners, with a medium to large effect size of D equals 0.48. Conversely, those assigned to violent video game conditions showed significantly increased hurting behavior, selecting more difficult puzzles, also with a substantial effect size of D.46. This means that the effects were substantial. Participants in the neutral game condition showed no significant deviation from baseline behavior. These findings provide compelling evidence that brief exposure to specific game content can produce immediate and measurable changes in behavioral tendencies. Study 3 is even more significant when considered within the broader framework of the study. The authors achieved triangulation, which they describe as the gold standard for establishing causal relationships in media effects research. By combining experimental evidence from American college students, correlational data from Singaporean adolescents, and longitudinal findings from Japanese children and adolescents, the research demonstrates converging evidence across diverse population, age groups, and cultural contexts. This triangulation approach substantially strengthens the generalizability and validity of the conclusion about prosocial gaming effects. These findings align with predictions from the general learning model, which posits that video games function as powerful pedagogical tools. In the short term, games prime specific behavioral scripts and provide immediate reinforcement for particular actions, as evidenced by the 20-minute exposure effects observed in Study 3. The long-term implications are particularly noteworthy. Repeated exposure to prosocial content can create what researchers term an upward spiral, where prosocial gaming increases prosocial tendencies, which in turn leads to selection of more prosocial content. This effect contrasts with the downward spiral associated with violent game exposure. Fundamentally, these studies demonstrate that on a larger scale, video games could serve as a powerful catalyst for positive social change. So moving on to the other article for this week, it provided a counter-argument and kind of like a different perspective to the Gentile article. It was more of an opinion piece than like an actual study. So basically, it talked about even though prosocial video games can help teach players empathy, it must not be confused with completely understanding someone else's lived experience. And just for a little background, empathy games are a subcategory of prosocial games, and they help players understand an experience outside of their own. Some examples of empathy games include Dysphoria, which explores gender dysphoria, That Dragon Cancer, which tells a story of parents coping with their child's terminal illness, and Project Syria, which tries to place players in the shoes of a Syrian refugee. But here's the important part. Just because a game helps you understand something outside of your own experience doesn't mean that you fully understand someone else's lived experience. There's a gap between simulating a situation and actually feeling it the way another person does. That's partly because it's difficult to use technology as a true conduit for empathy. Games can only go so far, unlike real-life human interactions. You're missing facial expressions, tone of voice, and emotional presence that creates genuine empathy. So this article was just trying to provide a different perspective, and I think it was really helpful to understand that you do need human interaction and actual understanding of other people alongside video games, which can, as learned in the Gentile article, promote prosocial behaviors. Well, that's all we have for you guys today. Thank you for your time. Please take a moment to answer the discussion questions we left on the post, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions. As we've seen, video games aren't just entertainment, they can shape how we think, feel, and relate to others. So that's just kind of the main point of the day. I hope you guys have a great day.